The cold wind slices at the skin. Above, the masts groan monotonously, and the air hangs heavy with the scent of salt water and hot tar. This deck is no place for adventure. Today, it is a scaffold. Horror freezes you from within. On the outside, there is only a chilling routine. The faces of the other sailors are either blank or twisted with fear for their own hides. The captain does not look like a sadist. He is a faceless executor of maritime law. His voice neither trembles nor breaks into a shout. He gives the order to proceed, in the same tone he used to command the anchor be raised. This mundane sound is more terrifying than any scream. The ropes pull taut. The body is ripped overboard, and the world dissolves into a dark, icy abyss. But falling into the ocean is not the end. It is only the beginning. And here, the first paradox arises. Why did pirates, whom we consider the embodiment of cruelty, avoid this punishment? They considered it ineffective. To them, every sailor was a valuable asset, not an expendable supply, unlike in the Royal Navies. What did they know that the officers, who saw themselves as bearers of the law, did not understand? The second question is even more terrifying. How is it possible for a person to be simultaneously drowned, torn apart alive by sharp shells, and bled to death in 30 seconds? What mechanism turned an official punishment into a multifaceted torture disguised as a legal procedure? To answer this, we will crack the Red Keel Code. We will break down the 7 key elements of this system of annihilation. You will understand not only how it worked, but also why the most terrible evil often operates strictly by the letter of the law. How could a punishment now classified as torture have been officially prescribed in the naval statutes of great powers? This was not vigilante justice. It was the letter of the law. The first element of the code is the naval statute. It created the illusion of justice. Keelhauling was prescribed for 3 great offenses: mutiny, cowardice in battle, or direct disobedience to the captain. It seemed an extreme measure for extreme cases. But here is what the archives hide. When the Dutch and British navies officially incorporated this procedure into their laws in the 17th century, cruelty became systemic. The captain transformed from a judge into an executioner with unlimited legalized power. The most terrifying monster on a ship is not a tyrant, but a soulless article of law. That is why the most chilling accounts of keelhauling are written not with a trembling hand, but in the dry language of a ship's log. If it was so horrific, why do ships' logs contain almost no emotional descriptions? Are these just sailors' tales? No. The records are shocking in their lack of detail. Here is an entry for an offense. A sailor refused to obey an order. Here is the sentence: keelhauling. The captain acts strictly according to the statute. But in the log, you will find no mention of screams, blood, or agony. The punishment is described in a single line, between entries about a change in wind and the remaining fresh water. To the system, a human life was inventory.
The entry: Seaman Jansen was keelhauled for disobedience, stood alongside the entry: 1 cask of salt beef has spoiled. But behind this bureaucratic coldness lay a complex and lethal mechanism. This procedure, described in a single sentence, actually had variations, and the choice between them decided everything. Where did this practice even come from in the civilized European navies? The Dutch West India Company's fleet was one of the first to systematize it. The British and other nations quickly adopted the practice. This created the appearance of a common European standard for naval discipline. However, the reality was more complex. The practice itself had existed for centuries, evolving from ancient Greek rituals of ship purification to a formalized execution. And the lack of a single, detailed regulation
gave captains enormous freedom in interpreting the punishment. This freedom was a death sentence. A captain could choose not only what to punish, but how. The severity of the torture could depend on his mood. It was this interpretation that gave rise to two different paths to hell. So we know what they were punished for. But did the condemned have even an illusory choice in how to die? No. That was decided for him. There were two types of keel hauling, across the hull and along the keel. The choice was between a very bad and an absolutely horrific option. But it depended not on humanity, but on the severity of the offense. The lighter option, across, was for less serious violations. The heavy one, along, was for mutineers. The method of execution became the final humiliation, a public display of the criminal's status. The difference in distance underwater could be up to 40 meters, about 130 feet. That is an eternity for a person without air. So why was one of these methods almost certain death, and the other absolutely guaranteed? Now we will go underwater and dissect their mechanics. Let's start with the version mistakenly considered lighter. When keel hauled across the hull, the trajectory is short, down one side, under the bottom, and up the other. Less distance means less time underwater. But this simplicity hides a trap. The body, tied to a short line, acted like a pendulum. It didn't glide, but struck the lowest point, the massive oak keel, with tremendous force. The dull crack of breaking bones and skull could be heard on deck. The chance of survival was reduced to 0 if the impact knocked the person unconscious, causing them to drown. This wasn't a humane execution, just a faster one. But it was merely a prelude to the method designed not for punishment, but for guaranteed annihilation. Lengthwise keel hauling turned the procedure into a marathon of agony. 2 teams of sailors at the bow and stern pulled the ropes. They dragged the body along the entire length of the hull. A 17th century frigate could be up to 60 meters long, nearly 200 feet. That's like dragging a person underwater along a 20-story building laid on its side. 3 to 4 times the distance meant 3 to 4 times as long without air. This guaranteed not just drowning, but a long, conscious suffocation. And more importantly, it ensured maximum contact with the hull's primary weapon. The slightest hesitation from the crew above, and the body would snag on the rudder, turning the execution into a suspension underwater. The victim's fate was in the hands of his comrades. Everything depended on the speed at which they pulled the lines. But it was a cruel trap with no right answer. Pulling too fast, and the body would slam against the hull, breaking bones. Pulling too slow, and the man would surely drown before he was halfway through. There was no ideal pace. Every pull of the rope made the sailors unwilling executioners, turning the execution into a lesson for them as well, making the entire crew complicit. Imagine yourself in their place. Pull faster or slower? We've analyzed the mechanics. Now, a question for you. Which of the 2 methods seems more sophisticated? The swift, crushing blow, or the slow, prolonged torment? The answer lies in one factor: consciousness. During a lengthwise keel hauling, the victim remained conscious for much longer, fully aware of every scrape against the hull, every second without air. The horror was not so much in the pain, but in experiencing it. This method was a weapon of psychological terror. We've examined the how. Now let's move to the medical what. What actually happens to a human body when it enters this meat grinder? What kills a person first when they are forced underwater against their will? Water in the lungs? The impact with the keel? No. The first killer is their own instinct. The first 5 seconds are a battle of reflexes. The shock of icy water triggers an involuntary gasp. In response, the larynx reflexively spasms shut to prevent water from entering the lungs. The body seems to be protecting itself, but this protective reflex is a trap. By blocking the path of water, the larynx also completely blocks access to air. The person doesn't drown. They begin to suffocate agonizingly while fully conscious, experiencing wild panic. Their body betrays them. A fire ignites in their chest from the lack of oxygen, and ahead looms a second threat, as hard as oak and utterly merciless. Besides drowning, what was more dangerous? A single powerful blow against the keel or multiple scraping contacts with the hull. At first glance, these are just blunt force traumas. A blow to the head, broken ribs, fractured arms. Severe, but potentially non-fatal injuries. The reality of the 17th century shatters this illusion. In the unsanitary conditions of a ship, without antibiotics or sterility, any open fracture almost guaranteed gangrene. The mortality rate from sepsis in such wounds reached 90%. Surviving the keelhauling was merely a postponed execution. The ship delivered 2 blows, one immediate, the other delayed. But the true executioner was invisible from the deck. It covered the entire underwater portion of the hull. Why did the few who survived often not remember the most terrifying moment? The contact with the keel? What shut down their consciousness? Hypoxia. Oxygen deprivation to the brain, combined with pain, shock, and panic, quickly led to unconsciousness. This seems like a mercy, a salvation from suffering. However, it was a guaranteed death. Losing consciousness, the victim stopped struggling. The muscles relaxed, including those of the larynx. The spasm passed, and the lungs would passively fill with water. The only way to stop feeling the pain was to die. But what if the victim remained conscious? Then they would come face to face with the ship's primary weapon. What did a man look like when he was pulled back on deck? And why did the sight of his wounds puzzle even experienced sailors? In a painting by Dutch artist Leo Verschuer, the victim's body is depicted as a bloody mess. The man was blue from hypoxia, unconscious. But most importantly, his body was covered not just in cuts or scrapes. The skin and muscle had been flayed off in strips, as if he'd been dragged over a coarse stone grater. This was inconsistent with contact with a relatively smooth wooden hull. Captains couldn't understand what was inflicting such specific, horrific injuries. The answer lay in marine biology. It was alive. The true executioner was neither man nor his law. It was the ship itself. Its underwater section, invisible from the deck, was covered with thousands of living blades. These were barnacles. Each is a small limestone volcano with razor-sharp edges. Now multiply that by tens of thousands of colonies covering the entire bottom. This wasn't a series of cuts. It was a solid, merciless grater that flayed skin and muscle from a man down to the bone in seconds. The ship ceased to be a mere vessel. It became a living predator. But just how dense was this deadly coating? The answer is shocking. The density of barnacle colonies on an untreated hull could reach 10,000 individuals per square meter, or about 10 square feet. This means that on an area the size of a typical table, there were 10,000 tiny razors. Slipping between them was impossible. The effect can be compared to dragging a naked body over coarse grit sandpaper the size of a ship. The cruelty of the punishment was directly dependent on the ship's maintenance schedule. The longer a ship was at sea without careening, that is, cleaning its bottom, the more lethal an instrument it became. A person's fate depended on bureaucracy. But these wounds killed not just with pain. They ensured that even someone who surfaced alive was already condemned. Why were these wounds far more dangerous than even deep cuts from a cutlass? Because they were not clean incisions but lacerations with a vast surface area. Seawater, filth, and myriad bacteria from the hull instantly entered them. In the unsanitary conditions of the 17th century, this guaranteed sepsis, blood poisoning,
Death came not underwater, but days later in an agony of fever. It was a delayed execution. The executioner's ship did not just maim. It poisoned its victim, leaving no chance of survival. The dying man's delirious fever served as a final lesson for the crew. But maritime legends are full of stories about lucky survivors. What if they aren't just tales? We understand what killed: water, impacts, barnacles, infections. It seems there was no chance, no loophole in this system of annihilation. However, defying logic, maritime folklore is full of stories of those who survived keelhauling. Where did these myths come from? And was there any real basis for them? What combination of factors, the crew's speed, the hull's cleanliness, the weather, the victim's physiology, had to align for a person to win this deadly lottery? Next, we will separate myth from fact and analyze the real chances of survival. How could it be that in a system of maritime justice, a man's life depended not on the severity of his crime, but on the speed of the wind and the cleanliness of the ship's hull? The very idea of a chance contradicts the idea of punishment. Its outcome was a lottery. At first glance, survival was influenced by 4 factors: the speed of the pull, the cleanliness of the hull, the water temperature, and the sailor's physical strength. It seemed that with a perfect confluence of circumstances, one could survive. But reality hit hard. None of these factors were under the victim's control. The speed depended on the crew's coordination and the weather. The hull's cleanliness depended on the bureaucratic careening schedule. A man's life was left to blind chance, making the punishment all the more cruel. Even if a sailor surfaced alive, he was covered in thousands of lacerations, making him a walking target for infection. And this brings us to the main myth, the stories of the lucky ones. The legends of survivors were passed down by word of mouth. Let's try to construct a perfect scenario. The ship is fresh from the dock, its hull smooth. The crew works with incredible coordination. The condemned is a young, strong sailor capable of holding his breath for a long time. It seems there's a chance. But the picture shatters when we add real-world details. Even with a smooth hull, the impact with the keel would break bones. Even if the sailor held his breath, laryngospasm from the icy water would instantly block his airway. The water temperature in the North Sea, even in summer, rarely exceeded 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That is cold enough to cause cold shock in 3 seconds, paralyzing the laryngeal muscles. Survival was so rare that each case became a legend, like a tale of encountering a sea monster. These myths were needed not to offer hope, but to create an illusion of justice. But if survival was nearly impossible, then the true purpose of the punishment was not aimed at the victim. It was aimed at those who remained on deck. Why did captains resort to such a complex procedure when they could have simply hanged the guilty man? What was the point of this cruel theater? A swift execution like hanging was too clean. It didn't leave the desired mark on the crew's memory. Death by a bullet was too similar to death in battle. It carried no humiliation. But here is what the naval statutes hide. Keelhauling was not an execution, but a corporal punishment, albeit one with an almost 100% fatality rate. This legal nuance transformed the punishment from murder into a public ritual demonstrating the captain's power over the life and body of a sailor. The process, not the result, was what mattered. The horror lay in everyone watching 30 seconds of agony that stretched into an eternity. The main objective was achieved not when the body disappeared underwater, but at the moment hundreds of eyes were transfixed on the spectacle. We've established the victim was doomed. But what was going through the minds of those pulling the ropes? A dead silence hung over the deck, broken only by the creak of the rigging and the captain's cold voice. The sailors' faces were stone, but behind them was fear.
Each man was not just sympathizing with the victim, he was mentally putting himself in that man's place. He saw not his comrade, but his own possible future for the slightest infraction. It was the most effective lesson in discipline, seared into the subconscious. Keelhauling was a brutally ingenious management tool, where the punishment of one became a psychological torture for all. This theater of horror was the key to maintaining iron discipline. And now we will analyze exactly how this psychological terror worked, and why it was more terrifying than death itself. Herein lies the main paradox of crowd psychology. Why did the sight of monstrous agony not incite a mutiny, but instead breed submission? Death by a bullet is quick, but the agony of a comrade for which you bear responsibility is seared into your memory for months. The fear of one's own torturous death is a far more powerful motivator than the fear of simply dying. But the crew was not merely an audience. The sailors, not the officers, pulled the ropes. This turned them from witnesses into accomplices, creating an unbearable burden of collective guilt. It worked like an electrical circuit. The captain merely closed the contact, but the current of terror passed through the hands of every man, making them part of the mechanism. The hands that pulled the rope could no longer clench into a fist for mutiny. This transformation of cruelty into normalcy was achieved through another tool: ritual. Why were all these formalities necessary? The assembly, the reading of the sentence, the last gulp of rum. They changed the nature of what was happening. The entire crew was on deck. The captain, from the ship's log, read an article of maritime law. The condemned was offered a cup. These actions lent the procedure the appearance of solemn and inevitable justice, not personal vengeance. But this ritual was a psychological defense for the executioners. By following protocol, the captain ceased to be a murderer and became an enforcer of the law. I was just following orders. Responsibility was shifted to a faceless system. Standing on the quarterdeck, he would read Article 32 of the Maritime Ordinance of 1629 in an icy voice. That sound, not the victim's screams, became the soundtrack of the execution. Ritual legitimized cruelty. But what happened when it was over, and silence fell upon the deck? The next day, a subdued silence and perfect order reigned on the ship. Orders were obeyed without question. From the perspective of the statutes, it was a resounding success. Discipline was restored. But this order came at a great price. Beneath it lay a toxic environment of total fear and distrust. Initiative was suppressed. Sailors were afraid to make any decisions, turning into thoughtless executors.
This was acceptable for the military machine of the Navy, where orders are not debated. In the Royal Navy, a sailor might not know the name of the man in the next hammock for months. On a pirate ship, everyone knew everyone else's share of the future plunder. This management method was effective for a hierarchy but utterly ruinous for a brotherhood. And this brings us to the solution of the main mystery. We have analyzed in detail the mechanism, the horror, and the psychological effect of keel hauling. All the pieces of the puzzle are on the table. It's time to return to the main question we asked at the very beginning. Why did pirates, for whom cruelty was a profession, rarely use this most agonizing form of punishment? They were outlaws, yet their internal justice proved more humane than official statutes. They were robbers, yet they valued the life of a crew member more than a Royal Navy captain did. How is this possible? The answer will not just explain their behavior. It will overturn our understanding of what we consider law and lawlessness. We have gathered 3 keys to the solution: the mechanics of torture, the psychology of fear, and the economics of survival. The solution to the pirate paradox will prove to be far more pragmatic and shocking than one might imagine. How is it that the most notorious cutthroats of the seas, pirates, use keel hauling incomparably less often than the captains of the Dutch and British navies? At first glance, the answer is obvious. The Navy is a system, and piracy is chaos.
It seems logical that pirates would require the most horrific punishments to keep their crews in line. But this logic collapses as soon as we change our perspective. A pirate ship is not a military machine. It is a commercial enterprise. And the crew are not subordinates, but shareholders. To maim an experienced gunner by keelhauling meant voluntarily reducing the effectiveness of a broadside by a quarter. This was a direct financial loss for everyone. For pirates, cruelty was an external tool for plunder, not an internal one for management. Their system was based on a different principle. But pirates were cruel too. How did they maintain order if they didn't use the most terrifying tool of intimidation? Marooning on a deserted island with a single bullet. Flogging with the cat o' nine tails until the bone showed. These punishments were agonizing and terrifying, and at first glance, no better than keelhauling. The key difference was the objective. Both flogging and marooning left a man a chance. To survive, to be rescued, to return to duty. They were reversible punishments. Keelhauling, as we've established, was an amputation, final and irreversible. The pirate code aimed to preserve a valuable asset or remove it harmlessly from the collective. The state's code aimed to destroy it as a lesson to others. Lawlessness proved more pragmatic because it was economically disadvantageous to break your own tools. But if even pragmatic pirates considered keelhauling excessive, why did the navies cling to it for so long? Why did the regular navies of Europe cling to this practice for nearly 2 centuries if it was so unpredictable and wasteful? The answer lies in the power of the law. Once written into the statutes, it becomes dogma. For the admirals, it was a legitimate, proven method. Abandoning it seemed like a weakening of authority, a risky experiment. But change came not from internal reform, but from an external wave. The abolition of keelhauling in the Dutch Navy in 1853 was prompted not by sailor mutinies, but by a global shift in consciousness. The ideas of humanism and the value of human life, born during the Enlightenment, finally reached the decks of warships. The law was abolished not because it stopped working, but because society finally recognized its monstrous inhumanity. Keelhauling faded into the past, but it left behind a frightening legacy. So keelhauling is in the past. Ships are clean, statutes humane. What lesson should we learn from this bloody stain on history? We have cracked its code. We understood the ruthless mechanics, felt the psychological horror, and solved the main paradox. But the story isn't over. Keelhauling is merely a hypertrophied example of how a system created for order becomes an instrument of inhumanity. How often today do law and justice diverge? We have broken down the 7 keys to this system of annihilation, and at the very end we will assemble them. You will see how legal, biological, and psychological factors intertwined to create the perfect torture machine. This is the legacy of the Red Keel, an eternal warning that the most terrifying monster can wear the mask of the law. It all began not with cruelty, but with an article of law, with the cold letter of a naval statute, like the Dutch Ordonnantiën Optediscipline. This document, intended to deliver justice, gave birth to a flawless killing machine. It took 3 great offenses and created for them 2 deadly rituals, lengthwise and crosswise keelhauling. Thus, a dry legal text became the blueprint for legalized torture. This system was brilliant in its inhumanity. It eliminated compassion. The captain was not a judge but an operator, whose only task was to set the mechanism in motion. A law created for order gave birth to a perfect and soulless machine of destruction. Upon this soulless mechanism, nature imposed its own uncontrollable horror. We remember the anatomy of a 30-second agony: shock, laryngeal spasm, suffocation. But the chief executioner was an accidental biological factor. A living grater of thousands of barnacles, each with 6 sharp limestone plates. This natural element, which the system didn't even account for, turned the punishment into a slaughter. It was this union of mechanics and biology that became a weapon of psychological terror. The agony of one became a mental torture for hundreds. Thus, a perfect mechanism of control was created, based not on respect for authority, but on a primal fear of a torturous death. It was this wastefulness that led us to solve the main paradox. The near-zero chance of survival meant the guaranteed loss of an experienced sailor. For the state machine of the Navy, a sailor was just a replaceable cog worth a month's wages. His destruction was an unpleasant but acceptable expense. Pirates, however, saw it differently. For them, each crew member was a shareholder, a valuable asset whose share of the plunder was worth hundreds of gold coins. His loss was a direct financial blow to everyone. The law proved more terrifying than lawlessness, because the state system could afford the luxury of being inhumane. The pirate business could not. We have answered all the questions we posed at the beginning, but the last one remains open, and it is addressed to you. What is the greater evil? The personal cruelty of a pirate who commits evil of his own free will? Or the soulless cruelty of a captain who commits evil by the letter of the law? Evil born from one person's will, or evil born from a faceless system? Lawlessness, which can be fought, or the law, which must be obeyed? Write a single word in the comments that you believe poses a greater threat to humanity: lawlessness or the system. This choice is the ultimate legacy of the Red Keel.